Eric, I've heard every possible explanation of consciousness, from it's a complete illusion that the brain is fooling us, to consciousness is the totality of reality, to things in the middle, that consciousness is an accidental emergence of the properties of human brains. From your work in belief systems, the nature of belief, metaphysics, some of your skepticism about introspection, when you step back from all of that, how do you reflect on consciousness?
So I don't know what consciousness is, and I don't know how to define it, but
and you're an expert.
I guess so. I'm a skeptic. I like to think about it in terms of examples of canonical cases of consciousness. I mean, one of the problems, I think, is if you try to define consciousness analytically in terms of something else, it doesn't work that way, or you can't do that without begging the question against certain theoretical views. Right? So if you say consciousness is self-awareness, right, then you're kind of assuming that there's a kind of epistemic relationship we have to our own consciousness, and I'm not sure I want to make that assumption. Other types of definitions that try to analyze consciousness into something else, I think, are always going to beg the question. So I think that we think about, or when I'm thinking about it, I think about examples like visual experience, auditory experience, the stream of speech that goes through your head, emotional reactions, those kinds of things. And so the way that I think of it is, I kind of, whatever it is that those things have in common, that other things that might in other ways be similar don't have in common.
No, it's very good. So let's develop that further. Where would you differentiate the things that have in common as part of consciousness from things that might seem to be the same thing but are not?
So that's where I fall down a little bit. Right, so I'm inclined to think, for example, that immune system response or early visual processing are things that our bodies do that are highly informationally sophisticated and yet don't seem like they're conscious. Now, I'm not sure that they're not conscious. I'm inclined to think that they're not, right? So one of the things you might say is, well, consciousness is the kind of thing that imagery and visual experience and emotional experience have in common that immune system response and what's going on in your retina lacks.
Or reflexes.
Or reflex actions kind of before they hit consciousness.
Yes, sir.
Right. So you kind of use the term consciousness as a finger to point to the one and point away from the other.
If something's on the table and it begins to fall, I'll grab it. And then it will come into my consciousness, but my consciousness, it wasn't enough time for my consciousness to grab it.
Right. That's what I'm inclined to think. Right. I'm not absolutely certain
No,
that's true.
No, right.
Right. But yeah, that seems like a probably, right? So then we use consciousness as a term to try to capture those things. But part of the problem with that approach to defining consciousness is that when there are things that it's not clear how to classify. Right. So if you take something like the hum of the refrigerator in the background when you're not paying attention to it, right? Do you include that as a canonical example of the kind of thing that is conscious? Or do you include that as an example of something that is conscious but is not in attention, right? Because maybe you want to, when you're defining something by pointing at examples, you want to point at a diversity of examples, right? So I was choosing emotional experience, imagery experience, and sense experience. You might want to say, okay, well, let's look at some examples that are outside of attention. So in a certain theoretical view, you would point to the hum of the refrigerator in the background as a canonical example of something that was conscious, but not in attention. John Searle does that, right? But someone else might think, no, that's not conscious, right? So they might not want that as an example. They might point to that as an example of something that's not conscious, but similar to consciousness, like I was using visual stimulation on the retina and immune system response, right? So those two people are going to point to different things as their starting point for their definition.
And that's why you had problems at the very beginning saying, I don't know how to define it, because that's a legitimate point. Yeah. I would look at it as opposed to the things that are in consciousness, but just the capacity. Consciousness as a capacity to have an inner sense of something. It's a capacity, and I can be conscious or not conscious of the hum. But if I am conscious of it, I know what it feels like to hear a hum. I know what that resonance is in me.
I'm not sure about that, right? So you're putting a
You
kind
got to
of
be a skeptic. Come on.
you're putting an epistemic kind of, you're building a certain kind of epistemic success into your characterization of consciousness, right? So, and I think that's very common. The word conscious, the word awareness, these kinds of words have both an epistemic face and what I think of as an experiential or phenomenal face. We talk about being conscious or aware of something as a way of saying that we know about it. Yeah. We also use it as a way of saying that we've got experience of it. And maybe it's true that those two things always go together, but I guess I think it's also possible that sometimes they come apart, that there might be phenomenology or a stream of experience of things that you really have no awareness of.
Yeah, I just wouldn't put that in the kind of consciousness that I'm defining it. So if I'm a behavior is not necessarily conscious or reflex. If something falls, I grab it, and I wasn't conscious of making that decision. After I did it, now I know I did it, and it's in my consciousness. So it's not a question of a behavior. You can have a behavior, in my opinion, without being conscious of it, without having that sentient feeling about it. It's a mechanism that we have learned or instinctual or something.
But could you have a sentient feeling without having any epistemic capacity to get at it, right? So if I think about, say, what was in the periphery of my experience 2 seconds ago when I wasn't thinking about it, what was in the periphery of my visual experience, right? Maybe I have no way of getting at that now, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't some visual experience there. It doesn't mean that there was. I'm not sure whether there was or there wasn't before I asked the question.
But I'm saying it doesn't matter, because if either way, the issue is if it were there, whether it was or that is irrelevant, but if it were, you have the capacity to feel what that was. If it's a crystal, and now I see it, and I didn't before, but if it is, now I have that feeling of what a crystal is.
Okay, so I agree with it when you put it in terms of feeling, but I don't agree when you put it in terms of self-knowledge or awareness, or something that implies epistemic success, right? So the idea is consciousness involves feeling in the broadest sense of that term.
Broadest sense,
something in your stream of experience, but then I want to leave it as an open question, how good our knowledge is, how good our epistemic access is to what's in that stream. And that's why I resist characterizations of consciousness that build into the very definition of consciousness that you've got some kind of self-awareness or some kind of knowledge of what's going on in that stream.
Given what you say is true, if I assume that I'm going to give that to you, what are then the implications of that to understand the fundamentals of what consciousness really is or how it comes about?
Well, it does seem to lead to pessimism about our ability to understand.
Right, that's what I was thinking, but hoping was not true.
Right. So, it certainly fits with my skepticism about introspective self-knowledge, and also with my skepticism about our ability to answer basic questions about the metaphysics of consciousness, basic questions about under what conditions the human organism is conscious or not conscious, or what aspects of our lives we're conscious or not conscious of. I'm pessimistic about all of those, and that certainly fits with my resistance to definitions of consciousness that build in an optimism.